Hello, everyone, and it's a delight to be here virtually at this digital surgery conference run and supported by Hillrock. Thank you for the kind introduction and, of course, invitation to speak amongst some amazing colleagues to this audience. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'm actually here at the moment in Egypt, in Cairo, on a little family holiday. But let's talk about the future of the OR. We can't talk about the future and to talk about its present form and also where we've come from, its past. With that in mind, I'd like to go back almost 1,000 years to around 1,000 years AD, where a surgeon called Al-Zarawi lived in the south of Spain in a place called Andalusia. Again, so he was an innovator, a person who's thinking about disruption, innovation, and the use of technology to promote and push forward the science of medicine as well as surgery. He spent his time thinking about how do we change the paradigm of traditional surgery to embrace new ideas. He was the first person to use catgut as a suture. Of course, we don't use catgut anymore, but again, changed the way we operated on our patients. He brought in cauterization as a technique. He also looked at special techniques for ENT surgery and urology, using methods to be able to look into a urethra and also other small parts and organs. But actually, more importantly, he wrote a book comprising 30 volumes. And this book was called Kitab al-Tasrif. This was hugely innovative, and it became the standard textbook for about 600 years across most of the kind of last 1,000 years. So it was disruptive, it was forward-thinking, and it lasted length of time. So it was disruptive, but then came a period of incremental changes in surgery, from this huge explosion from ideas, and also now, of course, where we are now. If we fast forward that whole circle, we're now in a position, we're thinking about new technologies, again, these exponential technologies, forwarding the science of surgery rapidly, the way we practice, the way we look after our patients, the tools that we have for us, particularly in the operating theatre, and it's changing immeasurably. It has been in the last few years. So that's history of where we were in terms of science of surgery. Well, actually, surgery itself has been defined by wars. Wars have promoted innovation. It led to many modern techniques of looking after the surgical patient, whether it's in trauma involving either guns or knives, etc. It allowed us to think about triage, allowed us to think about how we look after our patients in the acute phase, the golden hour of treatment. How do we mobilize patients quickly and understand the principles of resuscitation, response, and treatment? So we've seen many advances across the world. This is a picture from World War I, of course. We saw huge changes in the way we practice surgery, but also the development of the OR itself. Also remember, surgeons, I'm sure Zuba remembers this, is that we used to write handwritten notes for the operating ledger. So we think about the outcome, and we talk about the incision, the procedure, the position, the kind of the procedure itself, and post-op plans. I remember we used to write these only a few years ago around a kind of, I guess, an analog version of the modern electronic health record. We often had to describe pictures or write or draw pictures to illustrate what we were performing. This became part and parcel of medical record. So surgery was powered by wars to enhance and innovate, but also requiring analog data collection. Of course, this has now changed much in this modern world. If you look at the ORs, of course, this is the old operating theatre that's still present at Guy's Hospital in London. You can visit anytime in London, of course. You can see where the operations used to happen. It was a theatre. It was like lots of people could watch the operations on a kind of different levels within the OR itself. And then they could watch the surgeon in motion with his team, perhaps a few practitioners, and the patient lying on the table. Of course, asepsis was still early. We're discovering the value of having a clean environment, how to create different environments within the OR itself. And we've seen that change over many years. If you ever get a chance to come to London, come and see these old operating theatres, which are built with wood and actually have this kind of platform for viewing what's going on. And we've seen that, of course, across the world around these old operating theatres. Let's talk about the underlying issues we have to solve today as we develop the OR and its practitioners. If we go back a few years, almost a decade now, looking at the global strategy on human resources written by the WHO in 2030. It estimated that we would be short of healthcare workers in the order of 14.5 million people. That's nurses, that's doctors, that's surgeons, any healthcare workforce. So we've seen a huge disparity there of where we'd like to be by 2030, which is approaching rapidly, of course, and the deficits that we have. We've seen also the problems now in retaining healthcare workers. With the pandemic, we've seen a dearth of doctors, surgeries not as attractive as it was before. The team itself is changing rapidly in terms of what's on offer. And we are now moving on to a new era of a surgical workforce, of surgical training, and how an OR itself will equip itself in that future. You may all recall, of course, the Lancet Commission, which produced its report on global surgery around about 2015. It illustrated the vast disparity across the world. For the first time, surgery was thought to be a global burden. It was thought to be worse than the communicable diseases that were often illustrated, like TB and HIV in the past. It was estimated that 4.6 billion, that's largely 2/3 of the world's population, did not have access to safe and affordable surgery. This is not about major complex surgery. These are simple operations like appendectomy or a cesarean section or a management of a fracture. It was estimated by then that by 2030, we'd need 2.2 million extra surgical staff. That means anesthetists, surgeons, obstetricians, etc., to be able to maintain a kind of level of equity across the world. So we have a problem with workforce, particularly in our world of surgery. The pandemic, of course, has even illustrated that further. And if you look at the work done by COVID Surge or Global Surge, they looked at the first 12 weeks of the pandemic and showed suddenly we were short of a lot of operations not being performed. These were elective operations generally, and you can see the numbers there were mounting very rapidly. Now, across the world, it's had different effects. In the UK, we've suffered enormously with the lack of elective operations being carried forward, but we're now close to 6.5, if not 7 million operations that are outstanding that we have to perform over the next few years, or it may even be decades. So we have to understand, how do we overcome the burden of these problems, and how does the OR itself support the way in which we work better? Do we create more ORs? Do we improve efficiency? Do we somehow manage patients in a different way and use different OR systems or different operating theatres itself in terms of managing these patients that are complex, non-complex? We have to really think differently about this. In the UK, I was part of a workforce for London to create the surgical hubs. We now think about how do we create hubs for surgery to improve efficiency and the flow through these extra facilities to get through this huge waiting list. I remember visiting China and other places where you see a huge volume of patients. When I was in, for example, in Chengdu at the Western China Hospital, where essentially they had 10,000 beds or so, with 10,000 patients going through a clinic in the morning in a single specialty. So I was thinking, how do we understand the complexity? How do we ensure this flow through? And maybe the idea as we go forward is ensuring the OR itself is more efficient. There's more flow through, and we use that time more effectively. And actually, that requires a different way of thinking and perhaps technology in the future. The world is becoming more digital, of course it is. We're now seeing the implementation of digital technologies, particularly exacerbated or precipitated by the pandemic. We've seen acceleration of the ideas of innovation. We've seen quick transition and translation into clinical practice, and indeed in the world of surgery. The WHO itself recommended a number of interventions to be able to strengthen the system of healthcare by incorporating digital technologies. This, of course, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN. Of course, health is SDG 3. So we're aligned with the global purpose, but also we have the problems and the challenges facing us going forward. Of course, cost is an issue. Across the world, the GDP is rising year on year. There's more elderly patients, more people requiring treatment. And we have to now think smarter in terms of how do we use that same resource in a different way to overcome some of the challenges. In the UK, we're now pushing forward with our ideas and thoughts around this, whether it's the Future of Surgery Commission that was part of at the Royal College of Surgeons of England, or indeed looking at the TOPA review to create a healthcare workforce that's prepared for a digital future. And I remember Lord Aradazim wrote his document and white paper around saws and scalpels, lasers and robots, looking at advances over a decade ago. We've seen now the transition of all these ideas come to fruition and then be supported by policymakers, which is very important. This, of course, is like the new modern operating theatre, where you have amazing television systems or monitors with very complex apparatus and instrumentation. We have very few obstructions in the OR, a bed that's completely comfortable, it can be moved in any direction, actually all electronically managed, and we have a connected operating theatre. I guess the future has to be connected, and theatre has to be connected, including making sure that we share that data, to collect the data, and to improve the outcome as we go forward. That's really important when you're thinking about how you construct the OR in terms of the comfort, the environment, the sepsis, the antisepsis techniques you have in place, but also how a surgeon and the team can work in that space in a way that's more efficient. Let's go through a few things and find out where we were and where we are. You may recall the very first endoscopes were direct visualization. You could look straight into a camera and it had to be a straight tube to look through. That was the old rigid esophagoscope, or OGD, I guess you call it. So they were directly linked. Now, of course, we have amazing endoscopes that can be manipulated in 4 directions, in fact, all directions, with different camera systems, inverted, instrumentation, things pass through, biopsies taken. We've seen how that's transformed, and now onto systems and camera systems that are HD and XHD quality now. Of course, you can change also the technology around that by adding literal dyes and things to enhance pictures, particularly when looking at cancer and lymph nodes. The future might be looking at technique like this, where you're actually in VR, operating remotely on a screen in the VR itself. So the future might be this kind of robotic interface with VR technology and being able to operate anywhere in the world. So we've seen where that has come from in the past, and we're heading towards. I remember a few years ago, 3D laparoscopy came in, and I thought I'd tried using the 3D for some surgical operations. I'm a cancer surgeon working on colorectal cancer. I remember trying this out, see whether it could improve your field of distance or your depth perception. It was very difficult. Some technologies come in and just not fit for purpose. And this is one of them that didn't really take off because it was just too difficult to manage. It didn't really add more value. I think it made it more difficult because you'd only be in the glasses for a few hours. Sometimes we innovate hard in the OR. Sometimes it's great and it works really well. Otherwise, it's just not limited by a number of reasons. But we shouldn't stop innovating, of course, in this regard. The future OR, of course, is going to be very connected and very much based on robots, of course. This is Da Vinci, where now, of course, you have more space. You don't have the cramming of people around the operating table. You can work remotely on a monitor, so that you can actually now connect with other surgeons in the same room and be able to support one another. So it just looks like a different environment as we had before. And of course, it's minimalistic almost in that sense, and that makes it look more efficient. We're also being helped by safety. Safety is changing. One of the key parameters of designing the OR or improving it is to ensure that we keep it safe. Remember when the first WHO checklist came out, we had to suddenly think about how do we avoid those horrible errors that we have. In the UK, we call it the never events, leaving a swab inside an abdomen, for example, or taking the wrong leg off, or removing the wrong kidney. These happen. Although they're supposed to be never events, they happen too commonly to be called never. Huge problem, of course, in terms of patient outcomes and, of course, the morbidity associated with them. So when this came out, of course, it changed the way we think about the OR. It's structured, You tend to work in teams, the communication is improved, and we can't really work in isolation anymore. It's about teamwork, ensuring ultimately about patient safety. And now, of course, in most ORs in the world, we actually adhere to this and actually making sure that we're safe as we can. Surgical complications need to be kept at a minimum. I think with safety checklists going forward and other measures, it makes sense. But again, we're moving to this digital world where a lot of this could be done, for example, in a digital format. The other thing that we've got to think about is variability. Surgery itself is hugely variable. And my colleague, Professor Tim Briggs, many years ago in the UK, looked at orthopedic surgery and how the variation, depending upon where you were in the country, which hospital you're operating on. Each OR was different. Each experience was different. Each surgeon had different experiences or numbers of cases during doing the operations. So getting it right first time, GIRFT came out, showcasing actually to reduce variability, we have to understand the data, collect the data from the OR itself, looking at all the data points that we possibly can find, and to work out what works best for everybody, to make it uniform, to standardize. I think that's important in the context of outcomes, to improve surgical experience, and also for the patients, of course. We have to think about how do we standardize, ensuring that safe outcome. Actually, the OR makes sense because we have to ensure that we have standardized procedures, we have a checklist, we're going to make sure that we're very much holding safety at the top of our minds. And we've seen a number of reports come out for all specialties in the UK, not just medicine, not just surgery, but medical specialties as well. So this is the kind of area we're looking at going forward. The other thing to think about is the kind of evolution of the tools that we're allowed to use. Some of you may remember these. These are the old reusable trocars. They are really sharp instruments. And honestly, when you put those into an abdomen, for example, you were scared about damaging any organ because they're very, very sharp. And they were reusable at the time. We would use them, they're fine, and we could use them for a number of occasions. Of course, as time moved on and we had the problems with prion disease and infections and BSE from the bovine animals in the past, which led to a change to becoming more reusable. So now we're using single-use only devices or tools. We're seeing now many of those being used constantly. In fact, the OR is based on single-use only apparatus. So, but again, that's come a long way. But this will change again, I fear, because of the problems with climate change and sustainability. We're now moving to think about, can the OR be more sustainable in the future? Can reduce the CO2 emissions released from using single use only, whatever we use, whether it's drapes, whether it's trocars, etc. So the Royal College of Surgeons of England produced a report earlier this year on sustainability of operating theatre, looking at how much we can avoid the problems with climate change and how do we support it in terms of the climate change for 2050. So I think it's also important in the context of the OR to develop in the future to be sustainable. We always look at frugal innovation. Can the OR be more frugal? Because if you think about OR in rural countries or lower income countries, for example, how do we get a sustainable solution that's that can work across the world, not just in the UK or Singapore, for example? How do we create that so it's more equitable? So we have a huge challenge in our hands. On the one hand, we want sustainability. At the same time, we want to push the boundaries of what's possible in the future of surgery. Talking about balances, it's really interesting how the team has changed over the years. Many years ago, the surgeon was, of course, the archetypal person leading the operating theatre. Now we're seeing actually that's changing. We're seeing a team approach, whether it's the WHO checklist being checked by everybody, whether we're now saying we want surgical care practitioners or advanced practitioners or other professionals working with us. And I think that's important. The extended surgical team is now really relevant. If we're going to create a team that's more valuable and more viable going forward, it's important to extend the role of a surgeon and the team itself. I think it's about a multidisciplinary approach, or indeed retraining in different ways. During the pandemic, we've seen, for example, doctors, even surgeons, going to the front line or seeing patients in intensive care. Maybe we'll really think about how we utilize that workforce in a smarter way. If we're going to be short by many doctors going by 2030, then a smarter workforce has to be part of the arguments going forward. Excuse me. The other concept to think about is how do we train the practitioners in the OR for tomorrow? We've relied on analog teaching for many years, and we are going from analog to digital in all manners, etc. This is one concept, of course, around this concept of education 4.0. We've entered the world of, I guess, what's called the fourth industrial revolution. We know that. We've seen technologies coming in to help support us in that ambition. And healthcare is a key vertical for us, where actually it makes sense, where these technologies will underpin the future work. What about education? Well, actually, education is also changing. I'm sure others will speak about it during the day and how that's evolving to create more of a digital training for our staff. This is, of course, the story of where education is heading towards.
I remember the teacher talked and we listened. We had to memorise quite a lot too. A lot of time was spent giving out books and collecting them up again. We were sitting in rows in desks so we could see the board better because talk and chalk was the way.
There must be an industrial revolution in education, in which educational science and the ingenuity of educational technology combine to modernise the grossly inefficient and clumsy procedures of conventional education. Sidney L. Pressey, 1924.
These young people are studying in a new way.
A computing calculator designed for use in high school classrooms has created tremendous excitement among educators.
The tool which has made this possible is the high-speed digital computer operating with electronic precision on great quantities of information.
If we think about the third industrial revolution, that was PCs and the internet, and we just about caught up with that. The fourth industrial revolution is what becomes possible from those technologies.
Industry 4.0 is the next big shift in the way that manufacturing operates. Digital know-how is going to be hugely important, and then people will need to be flexible because the world will change.
The future workplace and future societies, we're still moulding them as we go, and technology is one of the main pillars in what is shaping what the future will look like.
The pace of change is remarkable, with the introduction of these exponential technologies creating a paradigm shift to create Education 4.0.
So as we think about this whole education piece, we think about actually the technologies that underpin this will evolve and support us, whether it's AR or VR, whether it's kind of remote learning, etc. We've got a new language now that we have to kind of facilitate. All these ideas now, new words, new terminologies have to be embedded into the world of medicine. Of course, the future OR will ultimately change. This is a video that I took of the future OR from Dubai Futures Museum. And if you haven't been to Dubai, please do go and see this amazing Futures Museum. The building itself is just incredible. But if you look at what that might be, here we are, a depiction of a room with a patient, for example, with sensors. The patient themselves will have sensors. The surgeon might have sensors in the future. We might get new tools created by 3D technology, 3D printing, for example. We may have mobile scanners using AI technology to decipher the images or the data that comes out of it. We might see this kind of whole concept looking at that future OR, coming from that room that I showed you earlier at the Guy's Hospital to where we are now and showing the direction of flow that we're getting towards. So hopefully that just gives you a flavor of the past, present, and potential future. And in my next talk in a short while, I'll talk to you about some of the solutions that I think will govern the world of surgery and the future OR. Thank you very much.